Hi, thanks for coming along to the talk today. It's about the Geek's Guide to Leading Teams. Now, what I find interesting is that in our industry, we have a lot of people who can talk about the sort of technical practices that we as developers need to get good at doing. So we have books on refactoring. We have people who can teach us how to write clean code. We have a lot of things to talk about continuous integration and now continuous delivery. But what about when we have to work with teams and work with people? So if you've been working in industry for a while as a developer, most organizations, you'll end up working with a team, and most likely you'll end up in a leadership position. And what I want to share during this presentation are really some of the things that I've learned working with lots of different teams, and then moving into a leadership position, and some of the skills and some of the things that you need to think about to help you prepare, because there's nothing really out there that can kind of help us. So before we kind of begin, you probably want to know, well, who am I? And a little bit about my background is, well, I'm a programmer at heart. So most of the time, I work for a consultancy, and I work with projects delivering software. As part of my role, I often end up as a team lead. And so I end up helping big teams kind of work and deliver projects for clients. At the same time, I'm very passionate about Agile, and I really am enthused about the way that's kind of working. And as Linda mentioned, I recently published a book called The Retrospective Handbook, because for me it's very essential to be learning and understanding how we improve our practices. I've been working with teams for about 6 to 7 years as a team lead, and a lot of the stuff I'll talk about are these experiences that I've kind of thought about over the time. But if you kind of are working in different environments, you might be thinking about, well, why is it that we need a team lead? So why is it that we need somebody from a technical perspective to lead a team? Now, I think about myself about when I first started programming. I joined a small group of people. I was actually the only developer on the team. So you end up with this sort of one target, and it's just you and yourself. Perhaps you've been in a situation like this before. And when you're thinking about what you need to deliver, it seems trivially easy. There's just this one thing, and we end up heading towards that target. Pretty easy, right? Now, in most organizations today, if you think about Google, that little search box, there's obviously a large organization behind it. And so we can't really do things by ourselves anymore these days because of the scale of the things that we need to actually achieve. So we end up working with a much larger team of some sort. And we have to work in these boundaries, and we have to understand what that is. We still have this goal that we'd like to achieve, but now we have a lot more people that we need to think about. So what happens is, well, we kind of end up wanting to head towards this target. And conceptually, everyone should know where this target is, and is starting to head in that same path. Now, in reality, what kind of happens is you do start off with this target, and you start off with this group of people, and you kind of end up starting on this path. But maybe what happens over time is that people kind of end up going in different directions. Who's been in a situation like this? Who actually, have worked on a project that doesn't actually know what they're there to do? I've certainly been in places like that where, you're there as a developer, but you don't really know what product, and perhaps the vision isn't so clear from the product owner. And so there's a lot of confusion around it. So it creates chaos, it creates anger, and as a developer, I know this, is that if I write something and it doesn't get used, I get frustrated. And it feels like a bit of a waste. So we all want to be kind of doing really well. So I think it's a really important thing to think about, particularly being a tech lead. And if you don't think this really happens in the real world, I have a good friend called Julian on Twitter, and he had this quote that I really love. I had 10 guys on my last project. All of them had opinions, and all of them were expressed in the code base. So if you think about Conway's law and 10 different ways of working, you end up with 10 different parts of the code base. And if somebody new comes onto the project or wants to change something else, you're kind of stuck. And so for me, I have a very simple test for what is an effective tech lead. And it looks like this. Does the code base look like it was written by a single person? So if you think about that sort of a first picture where we thought about the one person and that target, if you opened up random parts of the code base, does it feel the same sort of patterns are there? Does it feel consistent? And for me, this is one of the key responsibilities of a tech lead, is to really help shepherd people towards that goal, to help set that vision, that direction, and to make sure people end up going in that direction. And throughout this talk, we'll kind of talk about the different elements it takes to get to that point where it looks like a single person wrote the code base. Now, it doesn't happen in reality, but it's a nice simple test to think about. Do we have consistency in what we're actually doing? So the next question I really want to answer is, what does a good tech lead focus on? And for me, there are kind of 3 elements that I think about. And as a developer, when you're moving into this role, there are 2 that maybe you kind of have thought about, but haven't given a lot of time on. So the 3 elements that I'm kind of thinking about start with P, conveniently. The first one is obviously elements of programming. What makes a difference between a technical leader and a team leader is that somebody who is a tech lead has experience in programming and still has that experience. And so they're an active developer. I'll talk about that a bit more. The second element that we'll be talking about is about the people dimension. So as a developer, and I know this, I've been through this myself, is that you're focused on this small little area of the code that you're currently working on. You're not really thinking necessarily about the team, the groups of people that you're working with, and the people that you have to interact with, as well as the relationships between them. This is an element we'll focus on in the second part. And finally, when I talk about process, it's a terrible word, but it started with a P. It's kind of really thinking about how do the people and the programming sort of work together. And if I think about life cycles of teams and various things like that, we're going to be looking at, well, how does it work as a team process? So the first part is going to be exploring what is the programming elements of what a tech lead needs to do. And the first question a lot of people ask are, do effective technical leaders need to still code? And my answer to this is a definite yes. Now, the next question, I guess, is, well, how much should they code? If you're sort of working with a large team, it's going to be a little bit hard to be coding every day, just like everyone else. So what's the right balance? And I have a bit of a rule of thumb that I have here, which is at least I think you need 30% of your time with a team writing code. So this means out of a 5-day week, you need to be writing code at least 1.5 days out of that 5-week with the rest of the team. Now, why does this actually make sense? I think there's an interesting article here. It's called The Unspoken Truth About Managing Geeks. When you look at the slides, there's a link here anyway. And basically, this article, or the author of the article, is kind of talking about what is it that geeks kind of, how do you get along with geeks? His perspective is a little bit more in terms of the context of product owners and the business and working with developers. But in it, he writes this quote, "Respect is the currency of the realm." So imagine yourself on a development team working with other developers, and you know that there's somebody over there who's not really pulling their weight. They kind of surf the internet, they might do their own little side projects. What do? You probably get really frustrated. If you've been in a situation like this, you kind of, maybe they're not really helping with you sort of develop projects and actually write code that helps. But he goes on to say, the amount of respect an IT pro pays someone is a measure of how tolerable that person is when it comes to getting things done. Who feels this way? Okay. Well, when you think about it, for me, it really rung true with how I seem to see how things work. If you know about our industry, technology changes all the time. We are hearing about new languages coming out, one coming out this afternoon at the last keynote. And there's always new things to learn. And so we can't really be exceptional at everything that we do. However, we don't really like to work with people who make our job harder. So if you have people who aren't necessarily good or make your job a lot harder, it's very hard to understand what that means. And as a tech lead, I think it's very hard to make the right decisions or to understand what the team is going through unless you're actually part and you're going through that experience yourself. So I think one of the biggest things that you need to have as a tech lead is a rapport with the developers and the rest of the project. And in order to do that, I feel that you actually need to be coding with them. So you need to understand what the problems that they're experiencing are. You can't just listen to what people are saying. You actually have to experience it yourself. At the same time, you also have to have a certain amount of competence that you need to demonstrate to the rest of the people. Because if you're going to lead a team, they need to have confidence in your own ability. And therefore, you need to be able to demonstrate some of this. So 30% time you need to be coding with the team so that you can help build that respect and that you are actually part of that team as well. The next principle I have for leading development teams is really one about consistency over cleverness. So as much as I like using the latest tool and the latest language, that's really great if you're a single developer. But when you're actually thinking about an entire team and the sort of one direction that everyone's heading in, what I'm actually prioritizing as a tech lead is actually consistency. Because one of the problems that you generally have in sort of software teams is that you have a bit of a churn. And even if you don't have churn, you might end up with people with specialized knowledge in different parts of the code base. And so if you go back to that whole principle of trying to understand, does the code base look like it was written by a single person, you're really aiming for consistency rather than clever code that kind of hides stuff away. Now, one of the interesting things is that when we talk about consistency over cleverness, people who are actually trying to do clever things are actually trying to do the right thing. This is the whole retrospective prime directive. They really want to do and learn the latest things and want to apply it and make things simpler. But sometimes, as developers, we get caught up in our arguments over what is best. And unfortunately, I don't think there is a best thing in our sort of industry. There's always contextual best in terms of you need to understand what is good in your environment and what's suitable. And so in many teams that I've joined, there's often these debates. Tabs or spaces? No, we need 4 spaces, 2 spaces. We need curly braces on the next line or the one before. Do we use camel case or underscore notation? All of these little arguments, and you watch refactoring battles go on in the code base where people will check stuff out, refactor stuff, check it back in. And really, a lot of this stuff is a bit of a waste of time. So my whole thing that I talk to people about is that I think it's really important that we have consistency over cleverness, because there are more important topics to spend our time on. There are actually technically challenging problems that we should be spending our sort of efforts on exploring, on investigating, and trying to come up with creative solutions, rather than arguing for our own personal preference. When it comes to programming, I also think there's an element to team culture that we need to think about. And I'll talk about the people side a little bit later, but this is really about what is the team culture around the programming elements of how do people treat the development aspects. So for instance, one of the things I think about when you need to build a team culture is sort of thinking about a team charter of how you work, really. And one of the things that I these sets of questions are the things that I kind of think about when I think about how healthy is a team when it comes to technical prowess. So one thing is, how long does the build stay broken? So do we have a healthy culture of anyone can actually fix the build regardless of whether or not they thought they checked it in? Or do we get into entire arguments around, I didn't do that check-in, it's not my test that broke. What's that team culture around keeping that build healthy and green? Hopefully we all have builds. The next thing is, do people avoid conflict? So do people do that whole check out, refactor, check in, rather than actually saying, hey, I think we have a bit of a disagreement about our approach to this. Can we actually deal with it and have a conversation about it? So I think conflict in teams is essential to actually healthy teams. I think there's a bit of a picture-perfect team where everyone's smiling, getting along. And actually, I think that's a bit of a dream. I think it's healthy that teams have conflicts. What's important is, as a tech lead, you need to facilitate them through that conflict so you actually get to an answer of some sort. And I'll talk about the importance of conflict and why that's useful later. The other thing is, do people offer new ideas? I think as a tech lead, one of the things that I look for is really creating an environment where people feel that they can actually fail. Failure is important. Linda would have talked about it in her last talk, where actually the whole human mindset of learning and trying something else is about failure. We need an opportunity to feel that we are safe to fail. And as much as I hate being wrong in front of my team, I'll be one of the first people to actually say, hey, I tried something, I got it wrong, and we should move on and try something else. And I wonder how many people feel that they could actually do this in their teams right now, and how safe does that environment feel? Do people flag when they need help? Do you have people who go off in a corner for a week saying, oh, no, it'll be done. It's 90% done. It's almost done. And actually, I heard of a story about this recently from some ex-colleagues of mine. They're working with a small company where everyone's working in teams of 2 to 3 people. And they had one person on this team who had sort of broken away, and they were doing a new API for integration. And it was supposed to be done in 2 weeks. It's been 6 months. It's quite a while. And each week, people are asking, do you need help? And he's kind of got into this reinforcing cycle where it's like, no, I'm almost done. I don't need help. I'm almost done. And I think one of the things as a tech lead is that you need to be able to help people come out of stuff. As humans, we have personal pride. That's completely understandable. However, we need to be able to accept that we make mistakes, and we need to get through that. So these are some of the things that I think really make a big difference to our programming sense, because other people have skills that we don't have that we can tap into to help solve the problems that we can't necessarily by ourselves. And so we need to know when we need to ask for help. Finally, do people feel okay to admit that they're wrong? And I think there is a lot of stuff in developer circles about developer pride. And so think about the sort of environment that you're sort of fostering and thinking about whether or not people can actually answer yes to these questions. The next thing I think as a tech lead that you need to focus on from a programming sense is a vision. Who's heard of the XP practice, the metaphor? Okay. It was one of the XP edition 1. It got dropped in the 2nd edition. And for me, it's actually a really interesting thing because I don't maybe necessarily understand it as much as Kent Beck does. But for me, I think it's a really powerful thing is that can you actually articulate why your project or your software exists? What is the problem that that's trying to solve? And why is it important? As a developer, I think we all get kicks out of seeing the stuff that we create get used. There's nothing more, disappointing than writing software that gets thrown away or features that never get used. You kind of end up quite frustrated because it feels like you've spent a lot of effort to no avail. And so as a tech lead, one of the things I think about constantly is what is it that people need to hear to help them understand why they're here to do what they need to do? And if the answer is actually you need to cancel your project, maybe that's a good thing. I think it's important that people have a compelling vision and a purpose in programming. There are so many things that shouldn't be sort of written that can be done through manual sort of tasks and manual process that we shouldn't be writing software for, and we should be writing things that really add value. And so for me, the vision perspective is really important to what we're doing as programmers. So let's move on to the people aspect. And here's kind of where we stray away from maybe a little bit more of the classical stuff you hear in other talks. One of the things I think about is that there's something about strength in diversity. One of the things I do with a lot of the teams and the people that I work with is I help people introduce this book called the Strengths Finder book. Have many people heard of this? Okay, maybe one or two. So for me, it's really interesting because this book premise is, as people, we tend to focus, or at least our sort of education teaches us to focus on weaknesses. We can't have any weaknesses. We have to be good at everything. Unfortunately, what they've found out through a lot of research is that we're much better if we focus on our strengths. So, I mean, we have weaknesses and we should address them if they become sort of problematic, but we are much more successful if we know our strengths and if we focus on applying those strengths in all the things that we do. So this book talks about, I think it's 34 different signature themes, and they come up with about 5 different strengths. So they talk about what are your top 5 signature strengths that kind of come through. So I picked out a few that maybe make sense to people in a sort of software context. So maybe one of the things is intellection. So maybe you've worked with a developer like this who likes to think about a problem very deeply. They like to research, do a lot of reading. They like to think about the problem very deeply. They want to think about what's the right thing and think about other alternatives. On the flip side, you might have somebody who's an achiever, so somebody who just needs to get stuff done. Somebody who wants to see stuff out there and get stuff done quickly. And both of these things are very important in different contexts of where we work in software teams. So sometimes we do need to push very quickly to get something out there. But sometimes we have those really challenging problems that need a lot of thought. And one of the things that I really appreciate being a tech lead is that in a team of people, you have a much broader set of strengths than you do as an individual. And so understanding each of the different strengths of each person in your team makes you aware of at least where, when different tasks come up, what makes sense to actually apply in different contexts. So woo is really powerful when you actually need to work with business people who don't like talking to technical people. You need somebody to win people over so that they can open up to listening to why we might need to address architectural changes and why they might need to invest in operational infrastructure or monitoring or various things that perhaps they don't really make sense. And so by understanding the people in your team and the strengths that they have, you actually end up with a much stronger sort of group overall than if you were doing it individually. So one of the things that I think is really powerful in this book is that you can sort of get everyone a copy of the book and then work through them with their strengths and help them talk to each other about what their strengths are. If anything, I think it also helps everyone understand when everyone's like working closely together on the ground, where each person is coming from. I know I've certainly been a lot less frustrated by people who maybe need ideation, so they're looking at the latest and greatest things all the time instead of actually getting stuff done, because that's one of the things that they're very good at. And maybe when you're actually looking at new areas to sort of, in some sort of feature that you've never dealt with before, maybe they're the right person to help look at what are the different options out there that can help us achieve that new goal. So different contexts, different strengths. And if you don't believe me, I think there's some interesting statistics and research out there. And one of the things that I really appreciate working at our company is we really value diversity. So I think pretty much in the last 6 years, I've worked on a project where there's at least been one female developer on our sort of project. And I know of a lot of people in our industry who've never worked with a female developer. And I think it's really interesting that there's a paper here that said that with 3 or more women on the board, they gain significant performance advantage over those with the fewest. And if you look at the statistics, like in terms of actual monetary return, that's pretty amazing. This was a bit of an older paper, but there was a more recent one. Over the past 6 years, companies with at least some, so that means just one or more, female board representative outperformed those with no women on the board. And those with just men had 12% return on equity on their board. Those with women had 16%. So that's a third more. And I think it's very interesting because, once again, the sort of male-female thing, it is about diversity. It's about tapping into things about the way that people think differently, the different skills that they bring. And there's a really good book called The Difference. It's written by Scott Page, who's a lecturer at the University of Michigan, that actually has done a lot of research in terms of proving, and has got an amazing mathematical formula about proving how diversity makes sense. He has this formula, and this isn't the mathematical version, but he talks about collective accuracy equals the average accuracy plus the diversity in that group. Who's heard of the Netflix challenge? Okay, maybe 1 or 2. So it's quite an old thing now. I think it started in 2006. But Netflix is that, I think everyone at least knows the company because there's a few speakers from there. But they had a competition where they basically wanted to improve their recommendation algorithm. And so in 2006, they set out this competition, and Scott writes about it in his book, where the people that could actually improve their recommendation engine by 10% would win $1 million. Pretty cool, huh? And what they did was that it had to be by at least 10%. And for each year where people didn't achieve that, they would have a nominated prize of $50,000. So people could submit their sort of entries. And what was really interesting wasn't the fact that they actually got to their 10% improvement. It was actually interesting about how the teams and how they worked together in terms of winning the actual outcome. So in 2007, there were 3 leading teams: Belcore, Big Chaos, and Belcore in Big Chaos, which was actually a joint union. And all of them were doing pretty well, but it was the joint union that was doing a little bit better than everyone else. In 2009, one of the teams, so Belcore in Big Chaos, joined up with yet another group, and that became, I have to write it down because I can never remember it, Belcore's Pragmatic Chaos, in order to improve their recommendation engine even more. And so they actually hit the 10% at that point. But at the same time, they had another competing team who hit 10.09 called the Ensemble, which was also a group of different people who'd competed. And what was really interesting is that the final winner was actually an amalgamation of all the different people that got together, rather than the individuals who started off. And what's fascinating about this is that it's actually a little bit of a, it's a real good example of this, where their solution improved overall because they were able to integrate all the different ways and different algorithms that they had together in order to improve their recommendation engine. And I'd really recommend this book for going into a little bit more detail about why diversity matters. So when you're thinking about software and the problems that we deal with, as a tech lead, it's really important to value and appreciate the diversity of the group that you have. And what is really key is the small star that I have on the slide, which is you need that ability to integrate. So you need everyone to be able to work together in order to tap into this diversity. There's no sense in having a group of 6 people if all they do is work by themselves all the time, because you're not actually integrating all their solutions. I think one of the other things about people is that as humans, we're sort of built into this mode of working in small groups. And one of the things I think a lot of companies do is send people out on trust-building activity days. And I would actually say don't do that. Trust isn't built in a day. I've seen a lot of teams who go away, have a lot of fun. You know, they do something outdoors and as a group. But at the end of the day, when they come back into their working environment, they're no better off trusting each other. And one of the sort of secret things that I've learned over time is actually trust is built very incrementally. So the things that you can do to help sort of shape some of this stuff is like, you know, make people to go out to lunch together. Like, don't force them, but create opportunities to go and sit down to lunch together, to spend social time together. I live in London, and one of the biggest things there is actually making tea for each other. British people love their tea. I'm originally Australian, so I had to get into this whole tea making culture. And one of the things that they have in the mornings and the afternoons is they have rounds of tea. And so you're kind of making tea for each other, and you get to know what each person has. And just the small token acts of actually doing these things for each other is really important. We live kind of in a very gift economy in terms of the way that we give and receive trust, is that if I do something for you, I build a lot of trust. In terms of reciprocation. And that's just kind of how we're actually built. So I think one of the key takeaways I'd like you to think about is if you really want teams to get together, don't think about big bang things. Think about the small activities that happen daily that help people grow stronger relationships together. I think the next thing as a tech lead that you need to think about from a people perspective is really thinking about how do you grow the people on your team. And I really like this kind of model if you think about when you're picking something up new for the first time. So on the axis over there, we have how difficult is a challenge. And on the bottom axis, we have this thing about skill and ability. And one of the things about this kind of model is that if we're given something too challenging, but we don't have the skills for, we get really nervous. We get really we get the sweats, we're thinking about, I'm not so sure I can do this. I get really anxious about this sort of stuff. At the same time, if we're really good at something and we're not given anything stimulating, and the challenge is too easy for us, we get bored. And there's this thing where we kind of flow between these two sort of things. And the sweet spot that you kind of are thinking about is this section in the middle, where we want something a little bit above our ability so that we can actually grow and challenge us, but we don't want it too much because we might get really stressed out. At the same time, we don't really want to be at this place here where we're kind of bored. And so when I'm thinking about the sort of different tasks that need to be done or the different development activities, where skills lie in our sort of collective group of developers, one of the things I'm thinking about is how do I match up some of these skills and challenges? So one of the things I like doing is actually having one-on-ones with people and asking people about, what are their goals and what do they want to do? And I get a good sense about, where they currently sit to help understand what are the things that are coming up. So one of the things that you can then do is that you can give somebody a challenge that's a little bit outside of their current skill set, and you can support them in doing that sort of stuff. But one of the things you have to realize with this model is that humans learn and we get better at stuff, which is an amazing thing. But what that means is that we kind of end up sort of going back into this sort of thing. So once we get into that challenge, we get into this flow. You feel that adrenaline hit from solving something and get excited. But if we're given that task for too long, we might end up getting bored. So we always have this constant battle that we're thinking about is that as we get challenged and we overcome that, we then face another thing where we need something more challenging than that to keep us engaged. And so it's a little bit of a cyclic thing that becomes very hard to actually sort of think about. And it's a constantly evolving thing. And the great thing about the industry that we're in is that we have lots of problems to solve, so there's lots of things for people to think about and lots of opportunities to grow. The challenge is, as a lead, trying to work with a team and help them identify what makes sense for them and how they can help support each other. So I'd recommend the Flow book here, which is about the psychology of optimal experience, which talks about this model. The other thing that I think about a lot with the people that I have is about how do I maximize their potential. And I have this, I've recently sort of handed over my tech lead responsibilities to another developer on my team, so I could go back to just being a developer, which is wonderful. And one of the models that I wrote down for him was this one that we talked about. So when I'm thinking about a person, there's lots of different sort of elements to them. And one of the things that I'm looking for is that I need to really understand where their skill sets lie. So are they really great at sort of JavaScript? Are they really great at, I don't know, database type stuff? Are they really great at the operations type stuff? Are they good for the build management and sort of all of that sort of stuff? At the same time, I really want to understand their strengths. So where are they actually good at? Are they a completer? Are they one of those people that need to look for new things? And then what do they actually want to achieve out of this project? And then the final thing is really about their interests. So what is it that they're currently actively interested in? Web services or various things like that. And so what I'm trying to do is really get a profile about the team that I have and look for where the sweet spot of overlap is. And so the only way that you can really do this is actually by talking to everyone on the team. So you need to understand them a bit more. You want to have an open dialogue about trying to understand where that all kind of works. At the same time, you need to think about what things you can actually influence. So one of the things I think about is that, well, with skills, actually you can help build a lot of skills with people, right? So you can get external people who have expertise working with people, and you can grow that sort of stuff. You can, if you're an expert in a certain area, you can pair program with people and transfer those skills and help people grow that sort of stuff. That's something that you can actually influence a lot. You can also help sort of shape goals a little bit. Maybe people have their own sort of goals, but if people don't, you can help identify what is it that they feel passionate about, and maybe help them with that. You can't do that necessarily as easily as with skills. It's a little bit smaller. At the same time, also about interests. So there are tasks in development that we all need to kind of do, and it may not always be interesting to people, but you might be able to explain to somebody why it's important for success. So it's great that we actually wrote a new feature, but what's important is that getting live. So everyone has to take part in actually getting our code shipped into production, because that's really important, right? But maybe people don't like that. So you can help people understand the importance of things. But once again, it's a very small thing that you can influence, not as much as skills. And unfortunately, you can't really do anything about strengths. So in the Strengths Finder book, it's the kind of just something that we're kind of built with, the things that we like. You can't really influence that so much. But the things that you can do are you can help support learning and have lots of different activities for doing this sort of stuff. So some of the things that I like doing with different people, obviously pair programming is a really great thing if you're doing sort of XP. I find it really a great way of learning different techniques and things and spreading stuff around the team. Who's heard of brown bag sessions? Okay, good. But so basically, we have kind of lunchtime sessions where somebody might do a talk. And on our current project, we seem to be doing one every fortnight, and we rotate everyone through it. And everyone just talks about their pet personal project or what things that they're actually passionate about. And then I work with them to help support them in sort of preparing their presentations and talking to people about it. I know that some teams do like video or book clubs. So maybe you have a book and you're reading a chapter a week. And then you get together and talk about, well, what does domain-driven design have for us in this sort of team context? Or perhaps you watch like a 10-minute info queue video, and then discuss how is that applicable to what we have. Some of the things I've been experimenting with lately are things like technical or Spike showcases. So we maybe have heard about showcases in an agile iterative sense, where we showcase, here are all the different features in our sort of product that we've built in this sort of cycle. But maybe one of the things that we want to focus on is actually talking about what are the different things that we've learnt amongst developers and spread that knowledge as well. And it's really good when you're working with a large team to do this kind of Spike showcase type stuff, where actually what you're showing is some of the technical learnings and you're sort of amplifying that to the rest of the team. At the same time, I find technical focused retrospectives quite useful. I've been in many a retrospective where the developers dominate just because they have a lot of people compared to other roles, and they end up talking about things like, we don't spend enough time rotating through pairs, or the build has been broken a lot this iteration. And so a technical focused retrospective can actually help focus everyone on learning stuff about the code base and what other people are concerned about. And it also may lift the rest of your retrospectives, so they're actually kind of useful as well. And the other thing is whole team code reviews. So I don't know if anyone does these, but the way that I kind of conduct them is that we have a room, and then we get people to pick out different parts of the code base that they'd like to talk about, and then we project it up on the screen, and then we all kind of have a bit of a go at it kind of thing. And because we have kind of collective code ownership, there's none of this, one person has ownership of this, so they're not really going to be really defensive around this sort of part if we inspect it. And then we just talk about what are the things we'd like to improve around this sort of stuff. And then that kind of evolves in our sort of iterative code standards. So as we tackle new problems and we detect these kind of code smells, we get everyone together in a room and we project it up. And then we agree what's the best way forward of actually getting there. So I think that's a really useful thing about how we can amplify some of these learning sort of activities. The final thing about people is that people, it's really hard. It's very uncomfortable as a developer having to think about these kind of things. And one of the hardest bits of advice I've had to give people is really about beware the bad apple. And one of the things that I think is really contagious, I think, is that we can be really hard on ourselves and we can be really negative sometimes. And maybe you've worked with developers who are like this, who have a pet peeve of some sort, and all they do is talk about it constantly. And maybe that starts to infect everyone else in the project. And there's an interesting psychological paper called Bad is Stronger Than Good that talks about in order to offset sort of negative kind of comments of something, you need 10 positive reinforcement things to offset one negative stuff. So one of the things that I sort of give advice to tech leads when I'm sort of coaching them, when I'm working with them, is beware the bad apple. And there's different ways of actually dealing with this. So you might actually help them understand, how they're saying something is the thing that's actually affecting it. Or maybe they don't actually feel like they're being heard, so you want to give them an opportunity to do that. So maybe you have a way in a technical retrospective to be able to talk about some of the problems that they're actually seeing. What's important is that you don't let somebody stew, because that sort of stuff can actually spread, or the rest of the team might end up isolating that person, which isn't good for anyone. It's uncomfortable for the other person, it's uncomfortable for the team, and we need to be able to actually deal with this. So I think one of the best parts of advice is that as a tech lead, you need to actually develop skills in sort of conflict management and help people find ways of airing the issues that they have that are concerning them, and then find ways of overcoming that. And if that doesn't become, if that's not a viable solution, you may end up needing to recompose the team. So finally, I wanted to kind of talk about the process side to teams. And one of the questions I get a lot is it okay to tell people what to do? We kind of work in this collaborative space now, there's agile stuff, everyone's supposed to get along, but can I tell somebody what to do? And my advice to them is yes, but only sometimes. If you're telling somebody what to do all the time, there's definitely something wrong. And there's something called the situational leadership model that's really useful for understanding this. So they kind of talk about, do you direct people or do you support people, and the different combinations. And you go through this weird sort of cycle graph backwards in terms of thinking about, do you do sort of directing or coaching, supporting or delegating? And when you're thinking about this, one of the things that the model kind of talks about is you really, once again, need to understand where somebody is at with the task and the sort of skills of that person at the time. So one of the things they talk about in this model is if you have low competence, but somebody's really enthusiastic. So a really good example is if you have graduates straight from university who don't have experience, they're normally really enthusiastic. They want to program, but they don't really know how. They want to learn all this stuff, but they just, they're fresh on their journey. You might need to actually be helping them and directing them a lot more. On the flip side, you have somebody who's been picking up a skill, and you've probably been through this yourself, where you've been doing something, maybe you've started unit testing, but you're not quite comfortable with it yet, so you're not really so sure of it. So their term commitment kind of involves both confidence and motivation. So maybe they're not so confident in their own skills yet. And part of this model is then thinking about, you need to actually help coach that person in that situation. And then you kind of get on to more competence, but they're not really there in terms of commitment. So they understand and they're pretty competent and they know that they're pretty good, but maybe they don't understand why it's important. And this is where you might need to be supporting them in that sort of sense. And then finally, you have high competence and high commitment. That's basically something you can just delegate to something. So it's like, I trust you, you can deal with this, and I don't have to worry about it. So that's kind of that sort of model. The other thing I think a lot about is about Tuckmans. And it's a very old model. I think it comes from like 1970. But it's basically a study about how do teams form. And one of the comments that I've had from people before is that I think people say that actually, our team's been together for a long time. But I think one of the things is that actually you have one person join or you have one person leave, you have a new team. You go through this model again. So when you think about it, a group of people get together. They're definitely not a team. They're just starting to form. And then you start to get some conflict. So you get some disagreement, you get some arguing, and then you get through, if you can get through this stage, you get to some sort of normalization. And these two stages for me are really critical as a tech lead to really support. So you want to be able to embrace conflict and talk about issues openly, but you need to be able to get through that as well so that you get to norming. I've seen a lot of places where people avoid conflict and they end up in this kind of storming phase, and they never ever actually get to agreeing on how do they work as a group. If you've ever done sort of team chartering or sort of project charters, this is a really useful exercise to get through this. And if you can get through that, then you end up with a pretty high-performing team. So people who understand how each other works. And maybe once you finish a milestone, you end up adjourning. And I think this is something that they added onto their model, which is really good. And as a tech lead, you want to celebrate this part. It's a little bit sad sometimes because your team is kind of maybe breaking up or somebody is leaving, but you really want to help support this. And what I really want to think about, what I really want you to think about is when somebody does join or leave, you can go really dramatically from a performing team back into a forming team. So all it takes is one new person to join a team, and the whole dynamics will shift. Somebody who is very loud or somebody who's very quiet who doesn't fit in can change the entire dynamics. The same thing if somebody moves or changes positions, a lot of that sort of stuff can happen again. So like a lot of these models, you kind of need to be thinking about these constantly and seeing where your team's at. So small, inspect, and adapt, and see what things you might want to try to help get to the next stage. And I really like this quote, which is, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. So one of the things, for instance, that I think about here that both of these models don't cover is what happens if you're in a very chaotic environment. So you have 8 different people coming at the team all the time, demanding things get done. How does that actually affect some of this stuff? And both of those models don't really adjust for some of that stuff. So the biggest thing I want you guys to take away is that all of these are just models, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. And it's really thinking about what are the things that you can do to help improve this sort of stuff. The other thing I think as a tech lead you want to really think about is the process about you and spending time for yourself. I've watched a lot of team leads who end up sort of in meetings all day, who end up on email all the time, who never really get to spend time with the team. And if they do, they're maybe programming. But one of the things I found a lot of value in is actually making time for myself. So you can feel really inundated by all the things that can happen. And I think one of the things that made it easy to accept how to deal with this is actually, at the end of the day, you can't deal with everything. You have to find time where you need to spend thinking about the team. And so one of the things that I think about is, in my calendar week, really looking at ways that I can spend time thinking about how is the team doing? What are the smells that I'm actually experiencing? And what can we actually do about it? So I extracted out a calendar, a week out of my calendar. And this is kind of what I was kind of thinking about here. So I'm kind of a morning person. I'm from Brisbane, so the sun gets up very early. So I get up very early as well. So I like coming into work a little bit earlier before everyone else does. I get through all my email that I think I need to respond to, where I don't have to worry about it. And then I try not to check too much email throughout the day. I then have all the other activities that might happen. And then at the end of the day, at least twice a week, I try to set aside some planning time. Depending on what your environment's like, I find sometimes booking a room and just sitting in it by myself with my laptop thinking about stuff kind of is useful. My project manager does something similar to this, where he says, it may look like I'm not doing anything, but I'm actually thinking. And it's really important because, like retrospectives, we need a space to think about how are we actually doing? How do we evaluate ourselves? What are the things that we're looking at? It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day confusion and get reactionary. that you really need to set aside time to prioritize the activities that you're doing and work out what are the things that are essential that you should be doing that nobody else can do versus anything else. What are the things that nobody else is thinking about that you need to be thinking about and that you should prioritize that time? So all the elements I talked about are these kind of things. And then at the end of the week, I like to talk about sort of the next week and maybe adjust some of our practices or try something new with the team and think about that sort of stuff. What I really want you to take away from this Geek's Guide to Leading Teams is really thinking about these dimensions above and beyond being a developer. I think those developer skills are essential and are really important to you being effective as a technical leader. But there are two other dimensions in terms of the people and process that make you so much more effective as a technical leader and will help you achieve a lot more. So, does anyone have any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.